with, every day we hear about the crisis in the respective countries. I think this word crisis is misused. Almost everything is a crisis. The crisis happened in the 30s in the United States, when GDP declined cumulatively by more than 20%. And there's a crisis in Italy when GDP declined by 2%. So there's a certain exaggeration in the way reality is described. But this is not to deny that when you look at the Eurozone, you see some countries which have serious problems, but not all. So the first observation is that Germany is not in crisis. Finland is not in crisis. Netherlands is not in crisis. At least they are not regarded to be in crisis. Estonia is not in crisis. At least it's not listed among the crises. So you have two distinct groups. The first one is called Nordic, and the second one is called Southern or Periphery, and France is in between. So from this point of view, it is a mistake to speak of the crisis of the Eurozone. You may at the most speak of problems in some countries in the Eurozone. And I think there are three kinds of problems in some countries of the Eurozone. First of all, let me say that deep slowdowns in the economic growth due to boom and bust are costly. This is a comparison of two countries, Mexico and Spain. You can see that in 1960 they were at the same per capita level, and then they strongly diverged. And now, despite the crisis or problems in Spain, this country is twice as rich as Mexico. Why? We found in the book that the main reason for this divergence were three macroeconomic crises which were produced by bad policies in Mexico in the 80s and the 90s. So prudent macroeconomic policy, this is one lesson, is extremely important for economic growth in the longer term. Now, I think that one can speak of two kinds of, call it crisis, in some Eurozone countries, depending on the sequence. The first one starts with the financial sector, including the banking one, and this spills over to the fiscal, to the public finance. And this is Spain and Ireland in the Eurozone. The second has a reverse sequence. It starts with fiscal problems and spills over to the financial sector, call it Greek type. Now let me start with a brief description of the financial fiscal. So it starts, now the approximate cause of every bust is the previous bubble. So without the bubble, you don't have the bust. And so this is the private sector boom, which may occur in the stock market or even more dangerously in the real estate sector. It was recently the case. Now, during this private sector boom, growth is accelerated, and the budget benefits for extra revenues, and usually these extra revenues are spent. So you see, and then the bust comes inevitably, and you have a recession, and which means that revenues fall very sharply, while expenditures is not cut so quickly. And as a result, there is a sudden transition from ostensibly good fiscal situation to a very bad situation. In Spain, in 2008, as far as I remember, the balance was the budget was almost balanced. And then 2 years later, you have a huge budget deficit in the range of 8, 9, 10%. So the credit boom is very dangerous because it gives usually the rise to the bust. Now, this description is pretty obvious. What is not obvious, you have some examples as far as the figures are concerned, how the households' loans to GDP were growing in Ireland and Spain, and how the property index, the prices were growing. Now, this is more or less obvious. What is not obvious is what are the root causes. Why do we have, from time to time, extreme private sector credit boom? And as you can see, there are two orientations in explaining this. One blames just the markets, especially financial markets, or greed, whatever this means. And another one puts emphasis upon wrong incentives within which financial sector operates. The question is empirical. I must say I found much more proof, evidence that there were wrong policies which contribute to the crisis, including the recent crisis, and not just fatalities of human character. You cannot improve human nature. If you try, it's very dangerous and bad for the people. And people behavior depends on environment, which is, especially with respect to financial sector, created by public authorities. And this is an incomplete list of wrong policies which have contributed to the recent crisis. By the way, this standpoint has been represented also by the Larosière report. There was a high working group convened 3 years ago. I happen to be the member of this group in the European Union, and in the report you have a diagnosis of the reason of the crisis. And it was acknowledged that the crisis was to a large extent caused by bad policies, both central banks and or governments. For example, if you politicize credit to suit preferences of certain groups, it usually ends in malinvestment. This was the case in the United States. Almost every economy which is called capitalist has an enclave of socialism. And these enclaves contribute to problems why capitalism is blamed. In the United States, this was called housing credit, and Fannie Mae and credit, or these two huge institutions, which have been distributed cheap credit, and this has contributed to the crisis, plus an ideology that everybody, regardless of financial situation, should own a house. This is socialism within capitalism. What banks have the deepest, largest problems in Spain? What's their name? Cajas. Yes, you heard about Cajas. These are regional banks which are non-private. And they have been dominated by regional politicians who wanted to be popular and built a lot of aqua parks in Spain, regardless of demand. And they run huge losses now because there was not such a demand for aqua parks and new airports. Which banks have developed the most serious problems in Germany? Länderbanken, which are similar in political structure, were similar because they were dominated by regional politicians. So political preferences in the banks and political influence is very dangerous. But notice that this is not very often mentioned, and banks as such are being mostly blamed. So if you have a very easy monetary policy, as expressed in very low interest rates, this is dangerous in the longer run because it may fuel housing credit, other credits, and this was the case of Fed policy before the crisis. If you have a Greenspan doctrine, which says that you can do nothing when the asset bubble grows, but afterwards you should ease the monetary policy for a long time, it invites excessive risk-taking. Many governments subsidize mortgage credit because it's popular. Well, this is subsidizing risk. So if you subsidize risk, it was like you subsidize drivers to drive faster. And then you are surprised there are more accidents on highways. So similar with the financial sector. The policy, everybody has been complaining about so-called too big to fail. meaning that sufficiently large institutions, when they developed problems, were usually rescued, bailed out by the central banks and or governments. But what were the root causes of this situation? The very policy which has been deployed, it was started some 30, 40 years ago, when big institutions started to be bailed out, which has convinced the financial market that they are less risky than other institutions, and this was reflected, this belief among the creditors, in the lower risk premiums. So, and lower finance to large institutions. So as a result, large financial institutions to a large extent were a product of a distorted market. Markets were distorted by the government's policies. So there's a lot of these wrong policies, and the question is to which we can come in the debate, to what extent these wrong policies have been removed, future crisis. And to preempt a discussion, I would say to a little extent. Many wrong policies still remain in place, including the risk ratios, which are proposed by the Basel financial regulations. Now, this is the first type of a crisis. The second type is a Greek crisis, Greek-type crisis. The approximate reason is the systematic overspending, so spending more than the revenues. And as a result, you have accumulated public debt, so growing fiscal problems. But why these fiscal problems affect the financial sector in your own country? For the simple reason that when government borrows, it usually borrows from financial institutions in the country, including the banks. So when Greek government became de facto insolvent, it meant the Greek banks has been de facto insolvent as they are. Because banks have fatal attraction to lend their own governments, and this is to some extent due to perverse regulations which are still in force. Perverse banking regulations which make lending by the banks to own governments non-risky, zero credit weight. Banks are usually, there are concentration ratio in the banks, not allowing them to lend too much for certain private agents, but sovereigns have been excluded from that, etc. So there are some perverse regulations in this type. You can see this is illustration like in Greece and Portugal. There was a systematic overspending. But what are the root causes? That some governments, in some democratic societies, you have the systematic overspending. And if there is a systematic overspending, what is the spending which is too much? There's one type of spending which is excessive. If its total spending is excessive, this is social spending, which is, according to many politicians, the most important spending. But nowadays, social spending accounts for 70 to 80% of the total spending. When I say social spending, I have in mind two kinds of transfers. First, everything which you do not pay for, free health service, free education. Of course, you pay for it through taxes. So free is tax paid. And various transfers in cash, like unemployment benefits, other benefits, and pensions, if there are pay-as-you-go pensions. I am now not questioning in principle. I am not saying that if these transfers are very large, they undermine the public finance with serious consequences. And I can make a digression now about how the expansion of badly structured welfare state produces not only crisis like in Greece, but also stagnation before to some extent. And this is the danger in many European economies. Okay. Now, to speak about the public finances, to speak about spending. Because if taxes are large, they are large because spending is too large. So discuss taxes without spending does not make much sense. That's the first. The second, if historically speaking, there has been a huge rise in the spending to GDP ratio during less than 100 years. In the West, in the former Soviet bloc for different reasons, and many developing countries. You can see that until 2013, typical spending to GDP ratio was in range 10%, and it was enough to finance all the classical functions of the state, meaning defense, law and order, justice, to some extent infrastructure. And then, especially since the 30s and after the Second World War, there was a systematic expansion of the welfare spending until crises accumulated, problems accumulated. And then in some countries there was an attempt to do something about it, to restructure. In other countries, the only barrier is the crisis. So politicians wait and societies wait until they cannot go on, like in Greece. Now this shows that the 100% of the increase in total spending is accounted by the social spending. So it was not spending on defense or on culture or infrastructure which brought about this fiscal expansion. It was exclusively the expansion of the social spending which has inflated the government spending and of course require increases in taxes. Now this is not the whole story, because besides explicit debt, which is expressed in government securities, there is an implicit debt, which are promises contained in legislation but not yet financed. And some Western economists have huge implicit debt, which means they are going to reverse this, so they would have to change their legislation or go bust. This includes Germany. Not many implicit. Of course, they are going to reverse these legislative promises with certain problems. United States has huge implicit liabilities contained especially in Medicare legislation and what they call Social Security, which is pay-as-you-go system. Now, public finance, if it is in a bad shape, creates one of the two problems, or two problems in a sequence. First, it can produce stagnation, then crisis. I have discussed the link between bad fiscal stance and the crisis using the Greek example, but you may have before stagnation. Why stagnation? Well, first, because large social spending requires high taxes. And high taxes are not good for economic growth. Taxes differ in this negative effect. We know that indirect taxation is better from this point of view than direct, but top taxes are a barrier if they go beyond, say, 10 or 20%. But second, and this is less known, that part of the spending, social spending, if it is badly structured, slows down economic growth for two reasons. This is a diagram. First, if your social benefits, some social benefits may reduce labor supply. What are the examples? If it is very easy to get unemployment benefits for a longer time, this reduces the incentive of job search. This is empirical. There's nothing ideological. If women can go on maternity leave for 3 years, they would slow labor supply. They would have more difficulty in finding the job again. And this would, I don't think this sort of solutions increases the number of children. I don't remember any example for that. But it is very popular. If sickness benefits are high relative to wages, many people would be sick. That's human nature. We have in Poland a sort of natural experiment. We have one minority which gets 100% if they got sick of wages. These are policemen, judges, prosecutors, some other groups. And the others who've got 80%. Who is more sick? Policemen and prosecutors, because incentive work. And destructive incentive work too. So welfare states, if it is badly structured, creates bad incentives. Reduces labor supply. This is one example. If through sickness benefits, long maternity leave, or generous unemployment benefits for a longer time. And employment, so reduces employment, and employment matters. Early retirement is destructive, especially if, fortunately, people live longer lives, as is the case. So postponing retirement age is just elementary. You do it either before the crisis or because of the crisis. This is the choice. The Greeks have done it because of the crisis. They could not go on furthermore, and because of the pressure from other governments. Now, some welfare states, not all, create other perverse incentives. For example, there is an ample research in OECD, so-called job study, which shows that whenever you have a high structural unemployment, who pays the price? Not male, in the prime of age. Women and younger people are disproportionately unemployed. If you introduce regulations which privilege those who have already jobs, so high job protection, who pays the price? Outsiders who don't have yet the jobs. This is the story of Spain, Greece, Italy, Spain. And if you do not dare to reduce this protection for the privileged group and introduce completely flexible contracts, you have a dual labor market, which is not misuse of social transfer. You would think that Swedish people do not cheat, but Swedish belong also to the human race, and Germans too. So they cheat if there are perverse incentives. So you see in Sweden, when sickness benefits were increasing in generosity, then more and more healthy Swedes become sick. And Swiss doctor even came with new kinds of illnesses so as to qualify for sickness benefits. So for example, you can develop addiction for heavy metal music. That's true. So you qualified for a sickness benefit. And the Germans have, in Germany, there is a special expression, Sozialbetrug, meaning social cheating. Conclusion is you can demoralize even the Germans. They are not immune. You could see it when you compare East Germany and West Germany. The same German, completely different behavior because of different systems. So this same goes for welfare state, for large and badly structured welfare state. And whenever welfare state is large, it's usually badly structured. Not always, but usually badly structured. Now, combined with aging, which is already in force everywhere across Europe, and will be more and more incentive, the choice is either you reform welfare state or you run into long-term stagnation. And this is the big challenge, which was in existence even before the crisis, but so-called crisis, but the crisis made it more acute. So against this background, speaking about European social model is something very different and better than this supposedly cruel American model is a bad propaganda. Because rather, politicians should alert people, look, these are problems. Do you want to get jobs? Do you want growth? Then we have to change something. When I mention unemployment among younger people, then I should add one very destructive measure, and this is elementary economics, high minimum wage. high minimum wage kills jobs, among younger people especially, for the simple reason that younger people do not have much experience. And so in the eyes of private entrepreneurs, they cannot make large contribution to the enterprise. So if there is a high minimum wage, enterprise would not pay, and young people become unemployed. Well, sorry for speaking about this, because this is elementary. But I learned something upon coming into Lithuania. By the way, in Poland, some politicians also recommend higher minimum wage to cheat, because this is cheating. If they promise, in private relationship, somebody who cheats systematically would be accused and run into prison. Why not in politics? Why we accept political cheating and condemn private cheating? I thought always that morality is the same. So apply the same morality and choose conclusions. Okay, so this was the extension of the welfare state. One last word. Well, when during the Soviet times, when there were delegations sent from the former Soviet Union to the United States, and what was their typical reaction when they see shelves full of Coca-Cola, bananas, jeans, cars? Typical question was, what ministry is responsible for the supply in Coca-Cola, bananas, etc., because they could not imagine that impersonal forces, free market, can do the job. Now, this is mentality of Soviet official. I call it mentality of Soviet official. Whenever it expresses itself in a generalized belief that whatever is the problem, only the state can solve this problem. Now, mentality of Soviet official is still very strong with respect to the welfare services. Many people believe that without the state, people would be dying on the street. Nobody would go to the doctor, because if the state, meaning taxpayers, paid it, that nobody would learn alphabet, etc. That there would be no family taking care of the relatives, etc. This mentality of Soviet official with respect to welfare services is very strong. And we have to undermine it if you want to avoid stagnation. Because there is a very clean conflict between the present form of the welfare state and future growth. Now, in fact, the expansion of the welfare state has crowded out non-state forms of solving welfare problems. And this non-state form took form of churches and civil societies. For example, in Britain, there were friendly societies of workers. They associated freely in order to help each other. And as you see, at the peak, they had almost 7 million members. But then they were crowded out by expansion of the welfare state. So, coming up to the problem of the Eurozone, there are two kinds of a crisis. One starts with the financial sector and spills over to the fiscal. The second one starts with the fiscal and spills over to the financial. This fiscal overspending, it's exclusively due with the expansion of badly structured welfare state, which even without the crisis tends to produce stagnation via reducing labor supply, employment, and also private savings. If people believe that Santa Claus in the form of government would take care of them. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that in some Eurozone countries there are three problems. I mentioned that too. The third problem is accumulation of distortions. Regulation which limit competition or crowd out the markets. This is under the influence of pressure groups. And if you limit competition, you increase financial costs, then your competitiveness suffers over the longer run. And I think this is the Italian problem. In Italy, you do not have a financial boom, and there was not a fiscal expansion of the Greek type, but there was a systematic accumulation of distortion, which has produced stagnation in Italy for the last 10 years. And this, in conjunction with huge public debt, which they accumulated, produces problems in Italy. Some of these distortions were, of course, also present in Greece. And they complicated, and in Portugal, and they complicated the situation. So, in some countries of the Eurozone, there are serious problems. Does it mean that only in the Eurozone? No. Because we have examples of the financial fiscal crisis in Britain or United States. These are the southern countries. This is the counterpart of the southern countries in the Eurozone, and which are the Nordic outside the Eurozone. Canada, which has been doing quite well. To some extent, Mexico. So, what a great satisfaction to the Mexicans to be better than the US in this fiscal discipline. They have learned the hard lessons. So we can see that problems which appeared in some countries of the Eurozone are also present in some countries outside the Eurozone. And you have the Nordics outside the Eurozone, the true Nordic like Sweden. It's not a member of the Eurozone, but it's doing quite well relative to the other. What is the conclusion from this observation? Does it mean that Euro has nothing to do with the problems in some countries of the Eurozone? That this is purely accidental? If the same problems appear outside the Eurozone? And I think this is a big question. And my view is that there is some link between certain features of the Euro and problems in some countries of the Eurozone, even though I don't think this link is fatal, meaning that Eurozone has to dissolve before Lithuania enters. No, I think that there are three links. First, you might remember that everybody realized when Euro was created that fiscal discipline in the respective member countries is a very important, it's a must. And this is why Stability and Growth Pact was adopted, the Growth and Stability Pact, fiscal discipline. But it was not implemented. So that's a failure of implementation, and perhaps failure of design. The first violation was to admit Greece and Italy and Belgium, which surprisingly is doing quite well. Then France, Germany and France in 2003, I think, they violated, and they then modified the pact, which meant the pact was not binding, in fact. So one of the conditions of the proper functioning of the Eurozone was violated almost from the very beginning. The conclusion is fiscal discipline has to be reintroduced. And we can count on the European initiative which aim at this level. But there's a second link, which is, I think, less known. In most analysis of the impact or effects of entering the Eurozone, including those which were made by IMF, Polish National Bank, the fact that countries like Poland would, upon entering the Eurozone, obtain lower interest rates was presented only as a plus, as a benefit. More cheaper credit, more investment, while it has happened that it is a danger, because it can produce or contribute to the credit boom. And what I am speaking is not only the business side problem that if you are in a recession and another country is booming, then there are two different levels of interest rates which are good for each country. This is not the only problem. And by the way, I don't think this problem is very serious, because there is a tendency for synchronization of business cycle until recently at least. What I have in mind is a structural problem that for some countries, for most of the time, the desirable good interest rates may be lower than the one which is set by European Central Bank. And if market interest rates because this low level of interest rates set by the central bank are too low, then you have a crisis. You have a credit boom and a crisis. By the way, something of this sort has happened in the Baltics. Because with euro-based currency board, the Baltics are almost in the Eurozone. The same will go in Bulgaria. The question is, should these countries abandon? Those countries which should have high interest rates, like the members of Eurozone, Spain and Ireland. And those who aspire to be, should they abandon Eurozone? Well, I think there is a solution which needs still to work out, and this is called macroprudential regulation. So special regulations which make credit more expensive than the rate which is set only by monetary authorities. And this is up to macroprudential supervision to operate these instruments. I can give you one example. When I was still in the National Bank of Poland, central bank, then first we had our independent monetary policy, and we tried to be pretty restrictive. But second, when we have seen in 2005 and 2006 that credit denominated in foreign currencies is growing fast, 30–40% a year, we introduced extra regulation to slow it down, to make it less available. So my conclusion on that would be that for countries for which European central bank's interest rate would be dangerously low, there is a need for extra regulations, just in case, macroprudential regulations. And the third link between problems in the Eurozone, some countries of the Eurozone and the Euro is that cheap money was available to some countries, not to Germany, because Germany had low interest rate even before. But for countries which used to pay high interest rates and then they dropped, and cheap money available to some countries with weak disciplining institutions replaces reforms. So from this way, windfall gains, like if you discover all of a sudden abandoned deposit of gas, are very dangerous. And paying less for your debt is like a windfall gain. So there are certain links. Now I would end briefly with 2 points and then we have the discussion. Policies. Policies once the crisis in some countries of the Eurozone erupted. And I think there has been a big debate. Just a second. Just a second. Now, I think you can distinguish between two levels of policies in the Eurozone and European Union, the European level and national level. And within each level, you can distinguish policies which are called crisis management, policies which aim to make crisis less acute, and prevention of future crises, longer-term policies. Now, at the European level, the longer-term policies include six-pack and fiscal rules, which are supposed to be adopted by the respective countries. And I think this is an attempt to go to the basics, which were neglected, to make Growth and Stability Pact binding. That's a big question to what extent it's going to be binding. I would add to that one remark, that you cannot impose fiscal discipline on the longer run. You have to do it from within in the respective countries, which is the task of civil society. In every society, you have people who believe that your state is a Santa Claus, distributing money. You have to oppose these groups peacefully. You have to unmask the belief in the Santa Clauses. Otherwise, you end in stagnation. So civil society, free market institutes, good media are extremely important part of good democracy. political competition, this is to say competition between political parties, usually becomes destructive. So they compete who would give more. So you have to unmask them from outside the party system. Of course, it would be good, it is good to have some sensible parties who do not cheat the voters, but raise the risk of cheating from outside the party system. I think this is extremely important. In the final analysis, it is what matters. So this European initiative aiming at strengthening fiscal discipline go into the right direction, but in addition, you need national initiatives all the time. The second type of initiatives is bailouts, and this dominates the media. Whenever the European leaders meet, what do we speak about? Solidarity, which is a hugely misused word. Solidarity means that you would pay higher taxes. This is the meaning of solidarity. They speak about rescuing, etc. So bailouts are credits at concessional interest rates. And the big question is, can this policy be the final solution? And the answer is no. And we know it even before the crisis. Remember, whenever International Monetary Fund proposes credit, it is always conditional, and solutions are not these credits, but implementing conditionalities, assuming that it is right. If you do not implement, you would not return to the market. So my view would be that the ultimate solution lies with the respective countries to implement reforms, with bailouts or without bailouts. To be even more distinct, I would say there are no Italian solution, no European solution for the Italian problems. But there are Italian solutions for the Italian problems. So we have to look at what Monti government is doing. There are no European solution for the Spanish problems. But there are Spanish solutions for the Spanish problems. So let us look what Rajoy is doing. And there are two wrong beliefs which strengthen this mania about bailouts as solution, which is not. First, the belief about financial markets, expressed in such metaphors like contagion or domino effect. This expresses the view that once financial markets get disturbed, they act as a blind force. They do not distinguish. But they do distinguish, even though imperfectly. Otherwise, Germany would pay as much as Greece. And they distinguish over time. So if a country launches reforms, then yields which are very high initially tend to decline. And I would like to show you something which is, I think, which is important for the Baltics. Now, there are two groups of countries. The first is well known, it's called PIGS. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. The other is less known. It has a beautiful name, BEL. BEL, it is the Baltics and Bulgaria. Look, the BEL countries suffered much deeper decline in 2009 than the PIGS. But look how the BEL country GDP has been responding. Like in 19th century free market capitalism, V-shaped, deep recession V-shaped. Why such a decline? Because of the huge asset bubble. It was extreme credit bubble in the Baltics, to some less in Bulgaria, but still. Why such a return? Because of proper policies, largely speaking. Radical fiscal consolidation, not delaying things, etc. While in Greece you have the constant slowdown. Here what I've said, how the markets react. They initially, look, interest rates paid by the BEL country were very low until the crisis. They jumped very sharply. You see this period from 2009 until early 2008, but they did decline, which means that markets react to policies, even if the policy is not finally implemented. But they judge. And if you introduce proper policies, you get something from the markets. You pay less. If you don't, then you have to rely on bailouts. But for how long? So they believe that markets are blind is false. They're completely blind. They're imperfect, but probably less blind than some governments. And reforms, if they are properly structured and implemented, can produce what I call confidence effect. So the conclusion would be focus on what you have to fix in your country. You may use bailouts if you need, but they are not a solution. They may help you to pay less, but they may also demoralize or weaken incentives. Now, there's one type of a bailout which is a very controversial one. Some people say this is a solution. Some other people say this is a medicine worse than disease. This is the bailout from the European Central Bank. I belong to the second group. And I only show you why. Sorry. So first of all, I think this pressure from ECB to print money and then to buy government bonds is based largely on three rhetorical devices, which are not analytical arguments. And the effects in the longer run would be dead. Now, in some respects, if ECB engages in massive money printing in order to buy bonds of Italy or Spain, it would be worse than what Fed is doing. First, because when Fed is printing money, it's not in order to buy bonds of California or New Jersey. It is not bailing out in the true sense of this word. This is a federal level. But if ECB were to print money massively, it would be targeted to some countries. So this would be clearly bailout. And no justification that this is normal monetary policy can be credible because it stretches common sense. And second reason is that fortunately, European Central Bank has a much better mandate than Fed. Fed has dual mandate. It has to care about employment, it has to care about inflation. Fed has good, ECB has a good mandate, it has to care about inflation. Now, if it engages in massive money printing in order to bail out European Californias, it would break the mandate even more than Fed. And what is one of the problems in the European Union? The lack of confidence. Because treaties were signed and then broken. How can you solve this problem if you break a treaty even more? So I think this is a rhetorical question. Coming up to the last point, non-Euro countries, because this is in the title. Well, non-Euro countries cannot affect very much what Italy is doing or Spain is doing. Of course, they should try to focus on what is necessary, but non-Euro countries, including Poland, don't have much impact. What can these countries do? They should solve their own problems. So whenever you have problems in the fiscal sphere, fix it, but not by rising taxes, but lowering spending, which is current spending. If you have structural problems, especially in the labor market, remove it. So I would come to what I already said. The only good solution is in a focus, national focus, on right policies, which in practice mean that you have to clash peacefully with other groups and win this campaign. So winning campaign for good policies and blocking bad policies is ultimately the only good solution for a country to grow in democracy. Thank you very much for speaking a bit too long. And